All right. Yep. Is the picture framed right? All right. Okay.
According to Chris, there's no way to check the volume. So.
No, that's fine. All right. I'm going to start by confessing that Africa has always been a particularly difficult subject for me to think about. But I've been thinking about it a great deal because of this chapter. Humans originated in Africa. We have a consensus on that. Modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, originated in Africa. We have a consensus on that. The populations of modern humans that departed from Africa, whether to the Western Hemisphere or the Eastern Hemisphere, created civilizations, or things that we call civilizations, not necessarily agreeing on what the definition is. But in the human homeland, that does not develop. Egypt is near, but it really isn't the same thing as Ethiopia or Somalia or Kenya or wherever we think of as the homeland of humans. In a lecture I gave earlier, I suggested an approach to thinking about the emergence of civilization that conceived of it less as a step forward than as a solution to problems of shortage of space and resulting conflict that came about in certain specific areas at certain specific times. Looking at that, one could say, well, should civilization be seen as something that human groups descend into rather than that they rise into? Assuming, of course, that at the onset of those things we think of as the hallmarks of civilization, no one was capable of anticipating what civilization would lead to, as opposed to not having a civilization. It is quite clear that agriculture is a hallmark of civilization, but it is not a defining hallmark. That is to say, there are many societies in the world that develop agriculture that do not develop the sort of social stratification, division of labor, development of cities, et cetera, that we associate with the word civilization. There was a time when this was kind of glossed over. I recall reading an article long ago that said that the difference between grain growers and potato or yam or sweet potato growers is that grain growers had to work hard, follow the calendar, know when to plant and when to reap and so forth, whereas for all those other people who weren't growing grain, food was just kind of a found thing. They just dug in the ground and there was some food, like manna from heaven, and they didn't develop the habits of labor or the custom of viewing the heavens for indicators of seasonal change and so forth. And this was at a time when the notion that agriculture should be distinguished very strongly from vegiculture. That agriculture came from Latin agar, meaning a field, whereas vegiculture implied that you were having roots or rhizomes or other sorts of crops that did not have plowing or did not have field agriculture in the same sense of a field. Corn was always a problematic item here because it's a grain, but it wasn't planted in plowed fields. So in any case, the notion that there's some sort of equation between agriculture and civilization doesn't hold up. The people who argue that agriculture makes it possible to have a denser population are certainly true, are certainly accurate. On the other hand, agriculture, that is, say, the artificial planting and harvesting of domestic strains of plants, it doesn't seem to have universally produced the sort of population stress that is associated with, in this sort of formulation of things, with wheat and barley. This is surprising because wheat and barley on a calories per acre basis are nowhere near as nutritional as potatoes or maize or beans or things like that, so that if it's a matter of domestic plants producing more food and therefore enabling a larger population, it isn't among the grain growers that you would expect that to be most manifest. Okay, but grain growing has this ambiguous association with civilization. It's necessary, but it is not a sufficient cause. Another thing that appears to be associated with civilization is property. In classic European political science works, property is almost a defining characteristic of civilization. That the first person who says, the produce of that apple tree is mine, I own it, and now you have to exchange and barter for it, is sort of the prototype of the origin of property. Property actually shows up first, not surprisingly, in terms of objects, and you can see a differentiation in objects that show up in burials and so forth, even among certain foraging communities, so that one of the most successful non-agricultural, non-herding societies that we know of were the Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest, where they had much larger settlements than was common among foragers in other parts of the world because of the abundance of the fish resources that they had. And they had a practice known as a potlatch, whereby the status of a person was symbolized by his giving away property. Invite everyone to a feast and then overfeed them and then give them gifts when they leave and then, send a servant after them to give them more gifts. I mean, it's extravagant generosity becomes a hallmark, and that generosity is primarily in objects. The notion of property in terms of land, it's very difficult for me to see when that began, but I think it's rather late. For one thing, there was an awful lot of land. When you think of world population, of the entire globe having a population of a few million people, the notion that land could be a limited resource would only occur in areas where there were physical constraints on availability of land, like a river valley running through a desert, or a coastal settlement such as you had in the desert of Peru and northern Chile. But otherwise, land was abundant, and the notion of ownership of land is rather abstract. How, after all, do you think of ownership of land? Can you sell it? Well, then you have to have a market. What would a market mean before the invention of money? And after all, we had domestic crops growing for, 7,000 to 8,000 years before money appears. Not very clear what a market would be in terms of land in the earliest stages of things. On the other hand, there is one thing that can and almost certainly was owned, and that was livestock. Land was simply there, and you could plant a crop, you could harvest the crop, maybe some stronger person comes along and steals most of your harvest, but on a day-in, day-out basis, the land's not going anyplace, whereas your goat is. Somebody has to see to the animals. I know at least one society in the Sahara Desert where boys and girls would be given a goat at the age of 4, and then an additional goat every year, so that by the time they got to marriageable age, everyone in the society had a little flock of animals that they had to take care of. You started at 4 because at 4 you were old enough to chase your goat and keep it from running away and make sure it got fed and so forth and so on. So domestic animals, I don't want to get into the process of how domestication came about, but domestic animals seem to me very likely to have been the first property in a aside from simply objects like jewelry or a piece of clothing or a weapon or something of that sort. The first property that demanded attention. This is supported linguistically, so that in Latin, the word for money is pecunia. This is derived from the word pecus, which means sheep. In Arabic, the word for wealth is mal, goes back to a word meaning sheep. The notion of capital, capitale in Latin, which meant wealth in ancient Rome, comes from word capita, meaning a head, goes back to an Indo-European root, caput, that means head. Well, what sort of a head? Well, it's a head of cattle. You count animals by heads. You don't count corn or potatoes by heads. Potatoes maybe by eyes, I don't know. But the thing is, as you go from society to society and you look at the concept of wealth, is associated more with animals, particularly domestic animals, than it is with land. I can't think offhand of a general word for wealth or for property that is derived from a root relating to an expanse of land. Interestingly, when the Arabs had to invent a word for capital in the modern sense, they came up with Ras al Mal, meaning the head of the sheep. I mean, rat says head. So capitalism in Arabic is Ras Maliyah. So if you look at Africa, remember that's what I'm trying to talk about here. One of the questions to ask is, where are the animals? For the northern part of Africa, we have, herds and herds, flocks and flocks, lots of animals. There are sheep, there are goats, there are cattle, donkeys. There's a long bibliography of things relating to the domestication of animals in the Sahara Desert prior to the drying up that began in 5000 BC, and in areas farther to the north, and connections of those regions with the Middle East. But as you go south of the Sahara, first you hit a belt from Senegal across to Somalia and Kenya, where you have lots of animals, where you have herding peoples. Very often, peoples who assert dominance in an area. Then you go south of that and into equatorial Africa, which is presumably where the humans originated. And you say, well, what animals do you have there? And the answer, of course, is that you have wild animals. So what about domestic animals, property, in equatorial Africa, in the areas south of the region, the Sahel region, that flanks the Sahara to the south? This is an area with abundant food, with lots of water, and indeed with lots and lots of animals. But they aren't domestic by and large. So what about domestic species there? Are there pigs? And you'll find that when you get to equatorial Africa, there are some pigs, very, very few. In some areas, pigs are esteemed as pets, but not eaten. In Gabon, for example, in certain parts of it. But you have small numbers of pigs here and there in equatorial Africa, and they're usually described as being like feral dogs. In other words, they're feral pigs for the most part. They are not owned in herds. This is not a European pig culture where you have a flock of pigs that you drive out into the forest to eat acorns and then smoke the hams when winter comes. There's no winter. But rather you have some pigs, and it's very unclear how long the pigs have been there. Whether they are fairly recent introductions or whether they have been there for a long time. The standard book on the history of the domesticated animals of Africa is very non-committal on the question of where these pigs came from. Though we know there were lots of pigs in the Nile Valley. Egypt had pigs, but so they could have simply come down from Egypt. It's hard to know. Pigs don't walk very far, so unlikely that they just went exploring and ended up in the Congo. So then you think, well, what other animals I have? Well, they have goats. Dwarf goats. Almost all of the goats south of the Sahel zone belong to a whole variety of domestic breeds, and they're all dwarf. And by dwarf, we're talking about goats that at the shoulder are about yay high. No, maybe like that, 50 centimeters. So they're something like half the size of the goats that you have farther to the north. They have short legs. The body is about the same size, the torso. But they have these short legs, so that some of the goats, the stomach almost brushes the ground. They are widespread, and there is no consensus as to where in the world these dwarf goats came from, because we don't have any dwarf goats, at least not any notable ancestors, up in northern Africa or in Egypt or in the Middle East or other places. It's assumed that the goats must have come from someplace and gotten to Africa and developed dwarfism. Dwarfism is a very unusual development. You can induce dwarfism in captive breeding. We have obviously miniature dogs of different kinds. But as a natural evolutionary development, dwarfism is associated most strongly with islands and is associated with a lack of food. Island populations, if they are small animals and they live on islands like rats or rabbits, they grow bigger. And if they're big animals like ponies or pigs or goats, they grow smaller. And it all has to do with the quantity of resources. Well, Africa had no limit on the abundance of resources. There are certainly things for goats to eat. So one of the possibilities that is entertained is that there are dwarf goats because the people thought dwarf goats were kind of cool, and that they selected for dwarf goats. That they weren't selected, that, some of them will drink milk, but milk drinking, once you get south of the Sahel area, was pretty much unknown. But by and large, it looks as though the development of domestic animals, once you get down into the Sahel area and farther south, had a lot more to do with selecting animals that you wanted for some reason other than just basic consumption. For example, the animals in the Sahel area clearly have been picked to have piebald coloration, so that camels everywhere else and donkeys everywhere else are of a single color, and you get down to Mali or Niger, and the animals are black and white splotched or brown and white splotched, because people thought that was neat. They developed a really interesting variety of horn shapes. That was considered one of the most distinctive features of domestic animals. So that these goats, these dwarf goats, they may be alike in that they are all have short legs, but they have really interesting and diverse and twisty horns, because that was sort of a neat thing to do. There doesn't appear to be any place that had big herds of goats, and it doesn't appear as though they were treated as property in the sense of the herd animal property that underlies the Arabic notion of sheep, or the Latin notion of sheep, as sources of words for money or for wealth. So part of the question then is, does property develop in areas that do not have the extensive development of animal herding that you have in the old world? So do you have property, for example, in North and South America in the pre-Columbian period? Do you have property in Aboriginal Australia? Or is property something that is particular to the part of the world that developed extensive herding of domestic animals? I would point out the interesting phrase that we have, when you have someone's estate, on the one hand you have real estate, which is land property. On the other hand, goods and chattels. That's the other part of a person's estate. Well, the goods are the objects. The Haviland china and the glassware and the furniture and so forth. Those are your goods. The clothes in the closet. But what are the chattels? And where does this word come from? Well, not surprisingly, this is the word cattle. Comes from the same background through French. And the chattels consisted of that property that was animate, as opposed to real estate, which is inanimate and immovable, and goods, which are inanimate and movable. The animate property, these were your chattels. So that consisted of two things: your animals and your chattel slaves. So that slaves and animals become linked together as a portion of a person's property. So now if you look at North and South America in particular, and comparison with Africa, to the degree that you find that there is something that appears to be property, in the centuries for which we have so little concrete data, it appears to be chattels, property in humans. People owned or had slaves. Slaves could be exchanged. So that when we use slavery as the theme for talking about African history from antiquity onward, it may be that it is not simply the imposition of a European demand side obsession with this sort of human trafficking, but it may also reflect a peculiar importance given to humans as possessions in parts of the world that did not have domestic animals, and in parts of the world where real property, where real estate was not that important because real estate was abundant, and so far as we know, in many, if not most areas, collectively farmed rather than owned with very specific property boundaries. An argument can also be made that the state originates when people who have animals impose themselves upon people who are growing plants. There's some work being done right now by a student here on the question of why in the world did plowing ever originate? If all of North and South America and Southeast Asia and Africa south of the Sahara fed themselves perfectly well without plowing, why in the world did anyone ever invent the plow when you could simply take a sharp stick and poke a hole in the ground, or take a hoe and drag it along and you have a furrow. And the argument, of course, is that if you have a plow, you can have greater production because the animal is doing the work and it's pulling your sharp stick through the soil, and you get more production for the amount of labor that's expended, although in fact the oxen don't walk any faster than a person could have walked pulling a hoe behind him to dig a furrow. But the question that's being investigated is who owned the cattle, who owned the oxen? Because in order to have oxen for plowing, you need herds of animals. If you're going to plow up large areas of land, you need lots of oxen. And oxen need to be taken care of, and it may be that the owners of the oxen invented the plow and then said, you know, use our plow or we'll kill you. And you can use our plow, but you have to lease our oxen to pull the plow, and in return we'll take half of your crop. This may sound far-fetched, except that right down to the 20th century, in certain parts of the world, Iran, the one I know of best, landlords ordinarily would take a portion of the crop every year in return for having provided the animals that the peasants use to plow the ground. So provision of animals is not an obvious or a free good when you go back to ancient times. All right. In the non-imperial parts of North and South America, let's say the non-Aztec, non-Incan parts, and in Africa and Australia, you seem to have had populations that are more or less stable demographically, that subsist by a combination of growing plants and gaining livelihood from the environment, hunting, fishing, gathering, and so forth. In other words, the idea that there is a sharp boundary between hunting and gathering on the one hand and farming on the other hand really doesn't apply to very large parts of the world. You get an amalgam. You get people who are doing some farming, what we would call farming, and who are doing some hunting, or doing some fishing, gathering products, and producing stable populations, or at least demographically stable populations. And they're not producing civilizations. Now this was very troubling or very difficult for Europeans, I think, to understand. When Europeans encountered these populations directly after Columbus and the New World, but slightly before that in sub-Saharan Africa and somewhat after that in Australia and Southeast Asia, Europeans were coming out of they saw the world through lenses that put enormous priority on concepts like property, state, and religion. Not the oldie things, but just to pick three fairly obvious ones. You know, when we read our classic works in CC, we read about property, state, and religion. And it was natural that Europeans, when they got someplace, they would want to know, what religion do these people have? What is the structure of their state? And, you know, can I buy, some real estate? It's these are simply the things that people look through, the lens. Herding was almost disappeared from the analytical mentality of Europeans. Once you get into the post 1400 AD period, it's rather curious at the very end of Crime and Punishment, when the protagonist is off in prison in, deep in Russia. He looks across the river and sees nomads. And I always thought that was the alternative, the idyllic notion of the nomad. But nobody else seems to see it that way, so we'll forget about Dostoevsky. So Europeans tend to ignore or to fear pastoral nomads. I say fear because the legacy of the Mongol era was long-lasting, and it was simply a reinforcement of fears of nomads that had gone back to earlier times as well, and often warranted fears. So now they were getting to parts of the world that didn't have the religion, the state, and the property structures or outlook that they were expecting, and in fact that they used almost to define the nature of humanity. And they didn't have the pastoral nomadism that they tended to disdain, but they nevertheless recognized as being a kind of civilization. So they had a very hard time understanding what it was they were seeing. And they tended to see these societies in terms of deficiencies, either what they lacked or how they had something in such a weird and perverted fashion that one could not take it seriously. To get back into the mentality of this way of looking at these parts of the world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, I decided to go back to a reference book written 100 years ago, only 100 years ago, namely the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Comes out in 1911. And I picked the article on Nigeria to see how did Europeans using, or English-speaking people, using the most important reference work of the time, how did they learn something about Nigeria at the beginning of the 20th century? Before decolonization, before the popularization of anthropological theories, before pretty much anything was known about these areas beyond a few tales told by earlier travelers and adventurers. Now, as it turned out, the article on Nigeria in the 11th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica was written by a woman named Flora Louisa Shaw. Flora Louisa Shaw was among the most famous international newspaper reporters of her era. She traveled to Alaska for the gold rush, she traveled to Australia, she traveled all over the place, initially writing under the name F. Shaw to conceal the fact that she was a woman. But she was an eminently distinguished international correspondent, foreign correspondent, by the time you get to the 1890s. She coined the word Nigeria. Before that, it was known as the Royal Niger Company Lands or something like that. And she wrote something and made the argument, she said, to continue calling it the Royal Niger Company, this and that, this is very awkward. And some people saying we should call this Central Sudan, but no, let's call it Nigeria. And so she coined the word Nigeria, and now we have a country that we call Nigeria. So she was not, this is the reason when you look for the viewpoints of 100 years ago, this is the reason you go to the 11th edition of the Britannica. It's the last edition of the Britannica, in which all the articles are signed by notable scholars or notable figures. So when you go back there, you're not looking at simply some sort of paid editor who's updating the entry on Madonna, but rather, not that there's anything new to say, but but you're looking at someone who was respected as an authority at that time. So you're getting something of the official intellectual view of the time. Flora Louisa Shaw in 1902 married a man named Frederick Lugard, who became the Governor General of Nigeria. And after that, she's known as Lady Lugard. And he's one of the most important people in British colonial administration for his services in different parts of the British Empire. When she married him, he was governor of Hong Kong. And indeed, the two of them together pushed for the creation of the University of Hong Kong. They are the, Lugard's governorship is when the university is created. These were very active and dynamic, dedicated colonialists who thought that they were, if not doing the Lord's work, they were certainly doing the Queen's work, which was somewhat more important. Frederick Lugard was a man whose background was in the military. He had served in various military roles before becoming a colonial administrator. And let's say he was not the brains of the family. And indeed, his reputation largely was shaped for many years after that by what his wife wrote about his policies, which weren't actually his policies, but it was what she wrote about him. He said, "The typical African is a happy, thriftless, excitable person, lacking in self-control, discipline, and foresight, naturally courageous and naturally courteous and polite, full of personal vanity, with little sense of veracity. In brief, the virtues and defects of this race type are those of attractive children." All right, no big surprise there. Really, gutter level racism from as we understand it now, but also doesn't tell you very much. The idea that white European administrators look down on the African Negroes is no more surprising and no more revelatory than the idea that American slave owners look down on the slaves on their plantations. So you really need to look at what Flora, Lady Lugard, wrote to see a more interesting portrayal of who these Africans were. So this from the section of the article on Nigeria that she wrote, entitled Inhabitants. She lists a number of tribes, using the word tribe. She notes that at the time she's writing, she estimates the population of Nigeria at 15 million and the number of Europeans at 1,000. Civil servants, soldiers, traders, or missionaries as official personnel plus everyone else. So we're talking about a time when there was virtually no European physical presence there, even though they had long had a trading presence along the coast. Says, first referring to tribes in southern Nigeria, says, "All these tribes are fetish worshippers, though Christian and Muslim missionaries have made numerous converts. The Efiks, a coast tribe which has come into contact with white men, have adopted several European customs, and educated Efiks are employed in government service. The great secret society called Egbo is an Efik institution. Each tribe has a different juju, and each speaks a separate language or dialect, the most widely diffused tongues being Igbo and Efik, which have been reduced to writing. In general, little clothing is worn, but none of the tribes go absolutely nude. In color, the majority are dark chocolate, others are coal black, parenthesis, a tint much admired by the natives themselves, close parenthesis, or dark yellow-brown, Cannibalism, human sacrifice, and other revolting practices common to the tribes are gradually being stamped out under British control. Trial by ordeal and domestic slavery are still among the recognized institutions. In northern Nigeria, northern parts of Nigeria, the inhabitants are more of mixed blood, the Negro substratum having been to a great extent driven out by the northern races of the continent. She goes on to talk about the Hausa and the Fulani, who are the great herding societies of the north. And the Hausa, very much an urban society, though she doesn't mention the major Hausa cities. In general, the people living in the river valleys have been unaffected by Muslim propaganda, either in blood or religion. Thus, along the banks of the Niger, Benue, and other streams, the inhabitants are Negro and pagans, and generally of a purely savage, though often rather fine, type. Of these, the Munshi, who inhabit the district nearest the junction of the Benue with the Niger, were long noted for their intractability and hostility to strangers, whom they attacked with poisoned arrows. The Oragams, their neighbors, were cannibals. Nearer Yola lived the Buttas, who also had a bad reputation. These tribes, under British influence, are turning to trade and agriculture and agricultural pursuits. In the central hilly region of Kachia are other pagan tribes. They wear no clothes, and their bodies are covered with hair, unlike hers. South of the Benue, near the Tiber confluence, dwell the savage and warlike Okpotos, Basas, and other tribes. In the districts of Ilorin and Borgu, west of the Niger, the inhabitants are also Negroes and pagan, but of a more advanced type than the tribes of the river valleys. All right, this was compared with her husband's notion, oh, the African is simply childlike. This is more reflective of what passed as an ethnographic sensibility, 100 years ago. Only 100 years ago. We have tribes. The tribes are distinguished by how naked they are, by what sort of a fetish they might worship, or if they're of the finer type, they might be affected by Islam. And essentially, this is the sort of thing that we now completely deplore when we look back at the era of colonialism. You don't get things in quite this extreme a fashion if you are dealing with India, because there you have tribes, you have peoples, you have castes, but you can talk about their occupations. You know that none of these people are making anything. None of them are selling anything. None of them are growing anything. They're just there with their juju and their fetish and their secret society and their nude beaches and whatever. All right. Now the curious thing is that Africa had such an incredibly profound impact on the European imagination, and very much through this kind of writing. Very few Europeans went there. There were Europeans who went to South Africa, temperate country, where they could buy property, set up farms, bring in livestock, and have a European-type society in South Africa or what is now Zimbabwe. Or they went to Kenya, where in the highland areas they could have ranches and a more temperate stuff. But in equatorial Africa, the number of Europeans was incredibly small. The way Europeans knew about this area was filtered through communicators who were not creating Orientalist fantasies in order to facilitate domination, because the domination was there. You know, you didn't need to create these things as fantasies in order to convince the Europeans that this was an area that they could dominate, because the Orientalist fantasies were designed primarily for societies that were civilized, urban, productive, full of goods, and full of goods that the Europeans actually wanted to buy, whether they were ivory boxes from Damascus, or cotton prints from India, or tea from Ceylon, or woodcuts from Japan. The Orientalism that I talked about was really designed to diminish people who were potentially seen as cultural competitors or as cultural superiors, and who had in the past, arguably, and not even the distant past, been indeed cultural superiors. You go back to the period before the Renaissance, there's no question of the inferiority of European culture compared with India or China or Japan or the Middle East. And it's a difference that's gradually made up. But Orientalism was devised in this negative construction of Orientalism as a hammer to drive in the lesson that the superficial attractiveness of the cities and the products and the romantic costumes and so forth of the East are truly inferior to what Europe has. And they didn't have to do that for Africa. The assumption of inferiority was already there. This doesn't mean that it's not Orientalist, but it isn't Orientalist with the same instrumental impact of the Orientalism that you would have referring to the Middle East or China or India or Japan. The same thing would apply to the Aborigines in Australia. There was no need to prove that they were culturally inferior. That was taken as an assumption. So very few Europeans were communicating, and yet the image of Africa becomes overwhelming. You take a word like fetish. She says that all these tribes have fetishes. The amount of ink that is then spilled by Europeans thinking about fetishes is absolutely extraordinary. And I'm not talking here about, sucking your boyfriend's toes or something like that. I'm not talking about sexual fetishism. I'm talking about the idea of a fetish as a type of contact with the natural world. Is it religion or is it not religion? It turns out that generation after generation, you get European thinkers who are chewing on that issue. What is the relationship of fetishism? What is fetishism? How does it relate to religion? Is a fetish was an object, presumed to be an object. It was an object that had mysterious power of some sort. Was it worshipped? Well, maybe not. Was it used for magic? Well, maybe it was, but not always, maybe not. Then, related to it, came in the word totem. Was a fetish a totem? So then people wrote endlessly on the question of totemism and how it relate to fetishism. Totem, which originates as a North American Indian word referring to sibling relations and marriage limits. That was mistranslated by a European. The original of the word doesn't mean a symbolic being to whom a person or a tribe is related. But it makes no difference where the word comes from. But the idea is, if in totemism, which you have particularly in the Americas, particularly North America, and in Australia, there's the idea that either groups or individuals have a particular connection, conceived of in various ways, to some sort of natural object, either an animal or a plant or a physical feature of some sort. In one breakdown of this, the one by Claude Lévi-Strauss, he says, it can really take four forms. You can have a group that relates to a category of animals. For example, our tribe is descended from the porcupine. Or it can be a group related to a single animal. Our tribe descends from, the great porcupine, one particular porcupine. Or it could be an individual who relates to a category of animals, saying, I have taken the porcupine, or the porcupine has taken me as part of its clan. Or it can be an individual relating to an individual animal. In one scenario, with a child, you put an animal on its chest, and then you conceive of it as gradually melting through the chest and becoming internalized, so that person is now coterminous with that animal, which, we can do that now with, with good filming and show something entering the chest, but usually it's going the other direction. So there are endless notions of, is the totem, is the fetish the locus of a god? More often, the ethnographers sort of define it as sort of a friend or companion relationship, maybe. Is it demonic? Well, sometimes you get it portrayed that way, but not usually. But the concern over what were the spiritual feelings of these people in Africa and Australia, and how they relate to parallel feelings in the Americas, particularly outside the great civilizations, and remnants in, say, Central Asia or remote parts of India, people began to think that they were looking at a sort of primordial stratum in human existence. So some of them would say, well, you start with fetishism, and then you go to polytheism, and then you go to monotheism, and then you finally rise to Unitarianism or something like that. I mean, some people really literally try to portray this as part of that as you went back into Africa or Australia, we're actually going into the past and seeing the primal days of humanity. But there was no agreement on what this would mean. But it became a sort of a motif that could be picked up and transferred to other fields, such as sexuality, the notion of fetishism, or to buying cheap consumer goods with the Marxist notion of commodity fetishism, where you say that buying and using an iPod is a deliberate capitalist distraction to keep you from overthrowing the existing order, which is true, yes. So so Africa and Australia, and North America to some degree, but particularly Africa, becomes this source of thought, this source of images. I think for this reason, when you get to Art Hum and Picasso, and you have the big canvas, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, where you see some of these chubby ladies in sort of cubist construction with faces that are designed to look like African masks. When people first saw that, they thought, this is the most extraordinary thing. We've brought this Africanness into our art. Putting a Japanese motif in, which you can find in the Impressionists, is now something that we can trace back to in our history and say, oh yes, we can see where this costume or this design comes from Japanese woodcuts, but it didn't have a shocking impact in the way that Picasso's African masks did. Because it was primitive. The primitive, though, became very ambiguous because primitive also meant self-taught. And so primitive art was a word that can be used, but savage is another word that gets used. You know, the idea that you had a vast array of different sorts of African images, it didn't really strike people in particular. You know, Picasso showed an African mask on a cubist European head, and people said, that is Africa. Whereas now you go to any museum and you go to the African art section and you see that the variety and sophistication of African art is vast, and that there are some schools of African art that are hyper-realistic, that it isn't all abstraction, the famous Benin bronzes, for example. So then you have the idea that, well, this is also affecting music, and you'll have savagery in music. The impact of Africa on Europe may be greater than the impact of Europe on Africa. The Europeans, aside from the areas I mentioned, aren't very numerous. They, by and large, avoid educating local people or training them to do European things because that's expensive and because they didn't see what the financial returns would be. They did try to convert them to Christianity with sort of mixed success. So some areas become heavily Christianized. But on the whole, by the time you get to the 20th century, sub-Saharan Africa has not yet been impacted in the way that, let's say, India has been impacted by the British, or areas like Java, where you've had the introduction of coffee plantations, or Malaya, where you have the introduction of rubber plantations. Most of Africa does not develop a plantation economy. The economic value of Africa is modest until you find gold in South Africa and then diamonds. Well, but the riches of the ores of Africa, particularly the Katanga province of Congo, weren't really realized very early, because that's an inland area, and getting inland in Africa was slow. The number of Europeans around was very small. So, so if you look at the question of the relation of Europe to Africa and Australia, as I say, looking through the lens of 100 years ago, when you're interested in things like property and state and religion, all you see is sort of a blankness. And the people who saw something else were not the people who went there. Freud did not go off to some undeveloped land to think about totemism. Some of the anthropologists did. The anthropologists went places. But it was a very, very pronounced impact. Some of it had a genuine ethnographic substance to it. For example, when Lady Lugard mentions the what does she call it here? The great secret society called Egbo. Okay, Egbo, also known as Ekpe. This was indeed a secret society. It was one of a myriad of social structuring institutions in a generally propertyless region that existed alongside kingdoms, although kingdoms don't appear to have been all that numerous. Lord Lugard, for example, created what he called warrant chieftains, so that he would have somebody to negotiate with. And he would pick people who were influential and say, okay, you are the chieftain now, and some of them then claimed that they were an aristocracy of some sort, but this was rather artificial. Whereas something like the Egbo Society, which was not the only one, represented structures of organization that were not very apparent to people who were accustomed to a state. Somewhat similar to the ways in which Sufi brotherhoods were not very apparent in the nature of their structure and whether they were good or bad. In the case of the Egbo, you had a hierarchy. It was someone like Freemasons, I suppose, where males belonged. There were several different orders of rank. You could rise in rank, which you did through paying money, but also you then gained money from being of a higher rank. They developed a system of writing, we think. In Sabidi, there are hundreds of symbols that show up in Egbo contexts that have been recognized as being ideograms. In other words, you can say, well, that, if you use a symbol, that's a symbol for a woman, or the word woman, that's a symbol for a man. I think marriage is this, something like that. Whether, how old this is, tracing back these Insabidi signs, some people say that they go back to the first, maybe 400 AD, something like that. They're not simply a response to contact with the Arabic or the Latin alphabet. Maybe they were similar to some of the earliest signs that you had in the New World. But this was an important social structure that you had in Nigeria. And then it carries over into Cuba. So that in Cuba, the Egbo become the Abaquah. They have a similar set of structures, similar beliefs, remains a secret society, still exists, and it was long thought of as being somehow derivative from Catholicism or some Western tradition, or else a carryover from the Native American inhabitants of Cuba from the period of Columbus. But now generally is agreed that this is an import from West Africa that still exists, and it then becomes very much associated with certain musical traditions in Cuba and cultural traditions. So increasingly, I think there's, the scholarly community in particular became more and more absorbed with the idea of what places like sub-Saharan Africa and Australia represented in terms of the nature of humanity. And by contrast, had relatively little interest in things like economic development once it turned out that Africa was not an enormously wealthy place. And yet when all this studying was done, and there's this long history of anthropology, of ethnography, of psychology, of religious studies, trying to understand the nature of African societies or of Aboriginal society or North American native societies, when all is said and done, it still remained that this is a matter of looking at these people as objects. And when post-colonial studies came in, and I talked about last week, with the idea that to look at non-Western peoples as objects and to divide them into categories or impose upon them certain structural understandings that they themselves wouldn't necessarily have come up with. The idea in post-colonial studies came that this really isn't what we should be doing. And maybe we should go back and deconstruct and question all of the studies that were done over the last 150 years and see whether they were not only right or wrong, maybe that's not recoverable, but whether they were basically morally justifiable. The imposition of a notion of caste upon India, to the degree that that's associated with British imperialism there, or the structuring of native relations in Algeria as being between Berbers and Arabs, even though the Berbers and Arabs didn't see things that way. These had consequences in the same way in Africa the definition of boundaries and so on had consequences. But I think that what you have with Africa and Australia and the Americas is more profound in terms of its effect upon Euro-American mentality than what you have for India, China, Japan, and the Middle East. Now, in the United States, we may say this is a particular concern because of our own history of slavery and the fact that we have a population that has a very substantial African heritage. But when you look at European culture and the impact of this primitive or savage or primal human force that they rather arbitrarily ascribed to these these areas, you see that the impact on Europe was at least as great and probably greater than on the United States in some particular respects. So, in the very beginning of this week, I was talking about how I knew a economic historian of the last generation who believed that it was worthwhile to draw up a balance sheet. Colonialism, was it good or bad for country X? And you measure the investment, you measure the output, you measure the benefits, the drawbacks, and you come up with some sort of balance sheet, which he found basically positive. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that there's another kind of balance sheet that you can look at, which has to do more with the impact upon the imagination and the psyche of regions, and that's why I say it possibly Africa had more impact upon Europe and America than they have had upon Africa.